What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Before I get going, as always, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out on YouTube every single week. As always, splitting the show into two parts tonight. First, U.S. national team news. Of course, the men's team just qualified for the Nations League semifinals during this international break. So we're going to talk about that. And then also there was some important news on the women's side I'm going to get to. So that is going to be segment one. And then the second part of the show, previewing the rest of the European season, specifically focusing on storylines, getting you caught up on some of the things that maybe you weren't aware of that were happening in Europe's 5 major leagues, as we always, are focusing on the title race, but there are some other interesting things happening as well, so I will get into all of that later. First, though, plenty of U.S. national team news to discuss, starting with the men's national team getting into the Nations League semifinals with a pair of victories in this international break. I want to start with a very general statement coming off of the El Salvador game. People who are concerned about that performance, or people who expected something different in that game, have not been paying attention to how this works in CONCACAF, have not been paying attention to this El Salvador team, have not been paying attention to what happens in these kind of games. This is the reality of CONCACAF. Now, it's a little bit different because this wasn't on the road, and I put a lot of stock in the difficulty of CONCACAF games on the road. Would it have been nice to see a more comprehensive performance over 90 minutes? Sure. The first half wasn't inspiring. The second half was much better. But at the end of the day, they were the better team. They got the job done. Sometimes I feel like there's this just unrealistic expectation that every time you step on the field as the more talented team, you're supposed to dominate, you're supposed to win, 3, 4, 5-0, something like that. Because there's obviously a talent discrepancy here. But Manchester City lose to Crystal Palace. And Italy don't make World Cups. The Netherlands didn't make a World Cup recently. This sport, more than probably any other, gives you an opportunity to make up for a talent disparity. Because every decisive moment matters so much. Every, one goal, one moment can change a game in a way that it can't if it's a basketball game or a football game where you're scoring multiple touchdowns, you're scoring dozens of baskets. So there's no reason to be concerned here. The job is done. That's the most important part. This isn't even playing down to competition. This is just a different type of environment and a different type of challenge than this team had in the World Cup. And I said before the World Cup, this team is built to play in that tournament, not to kind of survive and get through qualifying and get through things like this to get to the Nations League semis where now you're playing Mexico. This is not designed to maximize this team, and that's okay. You'd rather have it this way than the other way, where teams are really good in qualifying and disappoint at the actual major tournaments and against the highest level opposition. This team can rise to the occasion against anybody. It doesn't mean they take these games lightly. It's just really difficult for this team to be at its best when the other team comes in intentionally trying to stop you from playing and trying to make things ugly and throwing all kinds of CONCACAF-y things at you. And so you've got to just celebrate the wins when they come and not make them all some kind of larger commentary on the status of this team. Now, there are a couple points I want to discuss about kind of takeaways and what this means moving forward. One, the issues that were discussed so much at the World Cup are still there. It's not a surprise. You don't fix those kind of things with the exact same roster in a couple months. The final third is bad. Their finishing is not great, and specifically their chance creation in the final third, sometimes they struggle with that too. They're just not a dynamic attacking team, no matter how much attacking talent they have. And you saw it again in specifically the El Salvador game. It's not surprising. It's what this team is. But there wasn't anything in here to feel like they had figured something out coming off of that World Cup. It's the hardest thing to do in the sport. They're not great at it yet. That's okay. I would rather, especially again in a knockout format, when you're talking about World Cups, when you're talking about Copa Americas and Gold Cups, I would rather have the firm defensive foundation and struggle on the attacking side of the field than the other way around. But the problems are still there. And that is going to be the biggest challenge for whoever the next permanent coach is can you get the final third figured out? Because the players are good enough. The product, the execution level, and the talent do not match right now. And that's the exciting part, is that there's a very logical belief that this can get better. But it's not there yet. And to that point, I mentioned this during the World Cup. The guy who seems capable, and maybe the only guy, of consistently unlocking defenses is Weston McKennie. And that's how the goal came in this game too. You saw the same thing in the World Cup. He can pick that pass, that one moment of quality that this team has so much trouble creating. Sometimes all they need is one, and he's usually the guy who delivers it. Now, you would love to not have to rely on that one guy to do it all by himself. But that's kind of the reality of the situation right now. And he delivered again. And he has the capability to be that guy sometimes. This is also part of, there aren't really any 10s here. And obviously they don't play with a 10. I think Brendan Aronson is a winger. I want him playing out wide because of his pressing and his understanding of space. This is why Jordy Mihailovic is a fascinating option to me over the next few years as we get into 2026 territory. Because he's another guy who can do... Now, passing isn't necessarily his... he's not Kevin De Bruyne with the ball at his feet. But he has some of that creativity, that ability to unlock and create things from that deeper lying attacking position, kind of that number 10 space. And this team doesn't really have a lot of that. The closest you have is maybe Brendan Aronson, but he's not a 10 in a traditional sense. The closest guy is Weston McKennie because of his ability to unlock a defense like he did in this game. That is one of the most important parts of this team right now because they don't really have anybody else who's doing that. But Weston McKennie made it happen. And then on the receiving end of that was Ricardo Pepi, who had a really nice couple of games here. That was a terrific finish. As much as I'm talking about the McKennie side of this, don't lose sight of how good of a finish that was from Pepi. That's the kind of finish that, in many ways, you've been waiting and waiting and waiting to see from the U.S. striker. Why? Because he wasn't thinking about it. Because he was so confident he knew exactly what was going to happen. That is a striker in form. That is a striker who believes in what he's doing. And it seems like every time somebody gets an opportunity for this team, the confidence goes the other direction. But Pepi has, obviously he's found his groove at the club level. At least temporarily. We'll see how this plays out long term and what happens in the summer. But then he translated it when he came on national team duty. He got right back into the team after being left off the World Cup roster, and he was really good. That's a very exciting development. Now, can you read too much into these two games and say Pepi's the guy going forward? Of course not. But it's completely fair to just celebrate a striker playing for this team looking that confident, because you haven't seen one in a long time. And maybe it's a coincidence this is happening with all of the Balogun talk. Maybe it's not. But this is also why you need multiple guys at every position who you believe in. Because some guys are going to be in form, some guys aren't. You need, when a guy kind of slips, you need somebody there to push him, to not allow them to be comfortable. Having Balogun in the fold is going to push Ricardo Pepi. And if Ricardo Pepi keeps scoring, he's going to make sure that position isn't handed to Florian Balogun if he ends up committing to the U.S. That's all good. That's one thing this team needs. Every team obviously can use more talent. But it's a different conversation if you look at the England squad. I'm not saying anything new here. But there are spots up for grabs. There are not enough completely solid, 100% confident, high-level players where you feel like they're just kind of bulletproof. That's the next step for this team is, can you get to that point? You're starting to develop the world-class talent, if you want to call it that. The guys playing at the highest level. You're seeing more and more of them. That was the previous step. Now it's, can you fill a squad full of those guys? Getting Balogun into the fold is going to help. And you also need Ricardo Pepi scoring goals and pushing him if Balogun comes. So, Pepi can only do what he can do with the opportunities that this team has in front of him, and he more than took this one. Good for him. That's a really good thing to see. The second player I want to give a shout out to is Miles Robinson. Miles Robinson is really, really good. And he looked like himself coming off of that horrific injury, which is great to see. He looked like the guy who had played himself into a lockdown starting position on this team. And assuming that continues, he's going to once again just reclaim that lockdown starting spot on this team. Because he is simply better than the other center back options out there. Outside of maybe Tim Ream right now. You can't argue with what Tim Ream's doing. But from a long-term perspective and a 2026 World Cup perspective, he's the front runner. So it was really good to get him back out there and just kind of ease any concerns about the impact of the injury. He looked like Miles Robinson. He reminded you why he had become the guy next to Walker Zimmerman. I don't care that he's in MLS and that you got these guys all across Europe. Nobody has been more impressive outside of Tim Ream than Miles Robinson. He showed you again in this El Salvador game. And like I mentioned earlier, this then sets up another game against Mexico in the semifinals. The last one was one of the wilder games I've ever seen. We'll see how this one goes. June 15th is when these games are going to be played, the semifinals. It's about continuing to learn how to win. It's about continuing to win trophies. It's about continuing to assert your dominance as the best team in this continent. You got through while navigating, the World Cup and all that kind of stuff. Now it's 2 games, 4 teams. The best 3 teams from this continent are in there. So theoretically, you're going to have to go through Mexico and Canada to win, which is exactly what you want. The table is laid out perfectly. Now it's just a question of, can this team defend their title in the Nations League? And is there a new coach in place by June? It seems unlikely. Incredibly unlikely. I might even go that far. That process will probably have started, maybe not even, because the deadline or the goal was kind of the Women's World Cup to have a sporting director in place, and that person's going to pick the head coach. So you're probably going to see something very similar to what you saw here with Anthony Hudson. Maybe things move faster, but that's something to keep in mind as well as you look forward to these games in June. Speaking of the Women's World Cup, the other major development I wanted to talk about here for a couple minutes is Julie Ertz's surprising return to the women's national team. Julie Ertz had not been playing anywhere for an extended period of time. I think it was something like, I don't even remember what the number was. This was not supposed to be in the cards. And all of a sudden, Julie Ertz is going to make an appearance in this final camp before the World Cup and is currently, according to Vlago Andonovsky, working on figuring out the club situation. Because, as it should be, you're not making this team for the World Cup if you're not playing regularly. I don't care who you are. This team is too good. So, everything that's been said, it sounds like this has been in the works, that she's been training at a high level, and This is done with the idea that there's going to be NWSL games to kind of get her back into the swing of things. So absolutely, if that's the plan and the intention, you bring her into this camp. You've got nothing to lose. You feel much better about bringing her potentially to a World Cup if you've seen her in camp, sometime in the somewhat recent past. So that's part of this, is just get her back into this team. This team has undergone some changes from, the ones that she's used to playing on, specifically up front. And also at the back with Naomi Girma. She needs to get used to playing with these players. And she's not playing with them at the club level right now. So, absolutely, this is the right call to bring her into the camp. And also, you're not committing yourself to anything. If it doesn't go well, if she's just not up to the standard, then you just leave her off the World Cup roster. But if this all works, and it kind of comes together as everybody hopes, she comes into this camp, she looks good, she gets her club situation figured out, that's going just fine, and she's back into the swing of things when you got to make decisions about who's going to Australia and New Zealand. This is the kind of thing that can swing the balance of power at the top of that Women's World Cup power rankings, if you will. This is the kind of thing that can be the difference between losing in the semis, losing in the final, and winning another World Cup. I firmly believe that. And here's why. I was talking about this coming out of the CONCACAF W Championship. The hole this team has is the position that Julie Ertz vacated when she stepped away to have her child, and she kind of took a little bit of a break from soccer. There are really good players who can play that position. Andy Sullivan, Christy Lewis, Sam Coffey has gotten a run since she broke into the NWSL and had that great rookie season. None of them are Julie Ertz. None of them balance that midfield the way she does. None of them bring the presence that she does. That's an incredibly important position, and it's kind of thrown the midfield out of whack not having her. If you get her back, that you can then pair with Rose Lavelle and Lindsay Horan, behind a front three of Alex Morgan, who's theoretically having another really good NWSL season at that point, and Sophia Smith and Mallory Swanson, still getting used to that. Naomi Girma at center back. You can work the rest of the defense out. It just feels so much better than having to rely on, and it's just one player, but it makes such a difference to have a midfield that that's been through this, that's been to World Cups, that knows how to get this done. Because you've got incredibly important players up front and incredibly important players in the back who haven't been there before. Not having to worry about your midfield, and specifically the player who's supposed to help your center backs and help your back line, is a massive help. And oh, by the way, Julie Ertz is 30. It's not like this is a 34, 35-year-old coming out of retirement for one last run at a World Cup. Yes, it's going to take her some time because she hasn't played competitively for a long time now. But this is a more than long enough runway to make this happen. And again, you're not committing to anything. You're not guaranteeing anything. If she's not ready, you don't bring her. But there is a hole that she can fill that changes how I feel about this team heading into the World Cup this summer. She is that important. And you can look at all of these different reasons why they just haven't been as good recently. You can point to the quality of the teams that they're playing. Specifically, kind of after the CONCACAF W Championship, you had the Germanys and the Spains and the Englands in there. You can talk about the fact that this is a transition time with all of those young players I mentioned who have not played many high stakes games and kind of got their first experience qualifying for the Olympics and the World Cup. You can point to all these different factors, but not having Julie Ertz is part of it. And so if you can start that midfield trio, or whatever it's going to end up looking like, with Swanson, Smith, and Morgan up top, you know what you've got defensively. You know you've got goalkeepers you can rely on. It changes the conversation. Because I've said this before and I'll say it again here. This is the first time we are walking into a Women's World Cup without a clear, obvious favorite. Without the expectation that the U.S. wins. And okay, that I should preface that by saying at the beginning that wasn't the case. But since the women's game has kind of evolved to the way that we know it today. 2010s, since the U.S. really emerged as the global power in women's soccer. The expectation all the way through 2019 is that the U.S. wins. Doesn't mean it always happens. But it is not coming in talking about all of our favorites. It is the favorite. And that will not be the case. Even if Julie Ertz is phenomenal and looks terrific coming into this tournament, it won't be the case. Because of what England have done, because of what you can go down the list of the European teams, but specifically England. And the way that England was challenged while winning the Euros by the Germanys. And, Spain's dealt with a lot, both injuries and off-field stuff. But that's still a phenomenal team. You get the point. Sweden haven't gone anywhere. This is the most balanced tournament we've ever seen on the women's side. Years past, previous tournaments, maybe you can get away without having Julie Ertz, and it just doesn't matter. This one, it very well may end up making all the difference. That's how important she is. That's how big of a development this will end up being if it goes the way everybody hopes and Julie Ertz ends up on that World Cup roster. I'm going to take my first break, step away real quickly. When I come back, kind of resetting everything in Europe, the storylines, the things you should be paying attention to during these final couple months of the season as we get closer and closer to deciding titles, who gets relegated, all of that stuff. You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Okay, I wanted to take some time as we're getting ready to come out of this international break to really kind of dive into the most interesting things happening in Europe's top 5 leagues as we're getting into the final stretch of the season here. So I'm just going to go through all 5 of them. Some of this stuff is fairly obvious in terms of who wins a title, European qualification, relegation. Those are major storylines in all of the leagues, of course. But I also wanted to highlight some other things and kind of dive a little bit deeper into the consequences and the different ways these stories are unfolding in all 5 leagues. So part of my goal with this is to also to catch you up if you haven't necessarily been paying close attention or you're only focused on the Premier League. And then second, to also highlight some of the things that maybe have flown under the radar as we're really focusing for good reason on things like title races and relegation, because there are a couple storylines that I am really, really curious about that don't really have much to do with either. So I'm going to get to those as well. Starting in the Premier League, And starting with the title race, of course, very simply, who wins, but also the historical significance of Arsenal potentially getting this title and the implications that has the potential developments at Manchester United in terms of the sale, what Newcastle are doing. This league could look very different in a season or two. And so this is a golden opportunity for Arsenal to get this trophy and to get themselves the title. They're 8 points up with an extra game played. This is by no means over, but they're in a really good position. They navigated what they needed to, and Manchester City could not capitalize on that bad stretch they had. I've kind of given my thoughts about this Arsenal team and about Mikel Arteta. I'm not going to go too deep into that. This is Arsenal's to lose. Can they? And they stumbled. Everybody kind of wondered if they were going to throw it away, and they responded big time, as they have all season. I expect that to continue, but they also have not faced this kind of pressure. It's one thing to have it in, February, March. It's another, as they learned last season, when you just don't have time to make up for the mistakes that you make, for the points that you drop. What does this look like at the end of April and in May, those final weeks of the season when titles get decided? Perhaps, one of the more interesting things for the Premier League, from my perspective, is going to be this top four battle. Obviously, it's a big storyline everywhere because of the consequences of reaching the Champions League. But specifically in the Premier League, okay, Spurs are in fourth. They have a 2-point cushion. Newcastle are actually fourth in points per game, which is something that doesn't get discussed enough. It annoys me most of the time when we kind of go, right, so Spurs are in fourth because they've played 2 extra games. Points per game actually indicates, and of course, you got to put the points on the board, but it's not like this is games in hand where you're just assuming teams are going to win. Newcastle are on pace right now to collect more points than Spurs. That matters to me. So I always look at points per game. And then the other factor here is that Brighton actually have a higher maximum point total than Spurs. The problem is they need to earn those points because those points currently are in the form of games in hand. So if they don't capture all of those points, we're having a little bit of a different conversation. But I've had Brighton really high in my top 25, and they're staying there because they are in the thick of this race. And Newcastle went that really long stretch without being able to win. Brighton have just been consistently really good. And we're going to have to see whether they can make these games up because they've always kind of just been behind everybody. And also Liverpool are only 7 points back with 2 games in hand. Still, somehow, some way. Every time you just kind of write them off, they find a way to hang in there. And I've talked about this before, this idea that this is not Liverpool clawing their way back into the race as much as it is people just leaving the door open for them to walk through because nobody is claiming fourth. What does this look like the rest of the season? Should be absolutely fascinating. And then you got the most compelling part of all, which is the relegation battle. There are 4 points now separating 12th and 20th place, which is ridiculous. And it's why you see Crystal Palace make a managerial change and bring back Roy Hodgson. It's not that Palace are having a bad season. It's that Palace, despite where they are on the table, are understandably worried they were going to get relegated with the rate they were going. And to a certain extent, they just moved backward by going, and I didn't get really a chance to talk about the Vieira sacking, so I'll spend a couple seconds here. To have one of the best seasons in club history, and to allow Vieira to kind of overhaul that team and completely redefine what Crystal Palace's squad looked like, and then fire him, after reportedly they were considering doing it way earlier, to bring back Roy Hodgson I get why, because you got to avoid relegation, and they were awful in attack. Those last few games under Vieira. But it's just such a huge step backward to go back where you were before all of the good work that Vieira did. Because this is not the same team that Hodgkin had during that last stint. This is a team that was supposed to be built for the future. This is an incredibly young team. One that I would argue you should be okay taking your lumps within the championship if it comes to that. But the money says otherwise, so Roy Hodgkin is back. On that same note, I brought this up before too, I think. Do we get another managerial change? I'm looking at you, Brendan Rodgers. I'm looking at you, David Moyes, in particular. Does anybody get freaked if we get a couple more weeks into this thing and one of those teams is still in the relegation zone? Because part of what's so fascinating about this is not just the amount of teams involved, but the names. West Ham, Leicester, Everton. You get the point. This is a truly special relegation battle that is going to be captivating until the very end. Then we head over to the Bundesliga, where obviously we have a really big story to discuss first, but there's also an interesting dynamic to the top four conversation I want to get to. So, starting in the title race, of course, this is the storyline because Bayern Munich are actually being challenged, because Bayern Munich actually aren't winning the league right now, because Bayern Munich just sacked Julian Nagelsmann and brought in Thomas Tuchel. You can go check my weekend recap video for my thoughts on that. I'm not going to regurgitate all of that here. So Dortmund have this 1 point lead heading into Der Klassiker. I've been saying this all season long. Bayern are vulnerable. They've done their part to make this a race somebody else can win. Dortmund, with that phenomenal run they had, kind of got themselves back in a position to capitalize. The third part of that had to be playing from ahead. I will never buy teams' chances when you are trying to chase a Bayern or a PSG or some kind of clear favorite in Manchester City. Hanging around isn't good enough. At some point, you have to surge ahead and make them earn more points than you. Because you're probably going to drop some at some point. And Dortmund had that draw with Schalke, but they responded. And they got the point. And then Bayern lost. And so here you go. Now, you might be able to win this thing with a draw in this game. Which was something before that last set of results I didn't think was possible. And obviously, if you win it, you're 4 points clear and in the driver's seat. And even if you lose, you still, if Bayern lose one game and you win that week, you make up all 3 points again. And you're back ahead. I do feel there's one more twist in this. Whether that's Dortmund getting a draw here and then dropping points and Bayern coming back to win, or Dortmund losing this game and then Bayern dropping points where they shouldn't and Dortmund surging back to win. I feel like there's going to be kind of two final acts. One will be Der Klassiker and one will be the final twist, the last time the lead changes hands. We'll see if I'm right on that. That's just kind of my gut feeling based on very little actual evidence or logic. And then we got the battle for top four. Union Berlin obviously had a great season. Freiburg have had a great season. Leipzig have kind of had a strange season. Were awful and then really good and now just kind of back to being okay. Those are your three teams pretty much battling for those final two Champions League spots. Right now, Leipzig are at the bottom of that list, which is interesting in and of itself, because that's a team that expects to make Champions League every single season, as they should. But even if Leipzig end up in one of those top four spots, Union Berlin or Freiburg are most likely going to be playing Champions League next season. And both of them got, European competition this season. But these are two teams that we don't expect to be in the Champions League. And the point I want to make with this is that it's a commentary on the struggles some of the other traditional teams have had in the Bundesliga this season. You look at Bayer Leverkusen now; they've really started to turn things around. But what Bayer Leverkusen have gone through, Borussia Mönchengladbach have been a non-factor, right? These teams that usually end up as that fourth team that get into the Champions League, they've just been nowhere to be found. It's been Union Berlin trying to get into the title race and hanging around most of the season. It's been Freiburg just being consistently really good for the most part. It's been Leipzig going up and down and looking at times like at least the third best team in the league, and other times not so much. But that's one of the fascinating parts of how this season has unfolded. It's not just the title race, but it's also what's happening underneath that. And we're going to see that continue to play out in this battle for the top four. And then, of course, relegation. I'm not going to dive too deep into these relegation battles, but we're talking about probably Hoffenheim, Hertha Berlin, Schalke, Stuttgart as your teams trying to keep themselves in the Bundesliga for next season. You've got kind of different situations there. You've got a Schalke team trying to reestablish itself. You've got some teams that have kind of been up and down and sort of trending toward this happening. You've got a team that's been much better than this for the most part and isn't usually, you've got a little bit of everything here. So we will see how that plays out. Then going to La Liga. This one is a little bit different because of the situation with the title race. So I'm just going to jump in here because my storyline for the title race is a little bit different. And it is, do Barcelona just cruise to this thing? Because to me, it's not a question of who wins at this point. I have been consistent for almost the entire season. Barcelona are significantly better than Real Madrid. I am not giving Real Madrid bonus points for doing it in the Champions League. If anything, I'm giving Barcelona extra credit points for doing it week in and week out. And then Barcelona have gone and validated that every time they played Real Madrid. I know they lost the first one, but they weren't even bad in that game. And then they've taken care of business since. Can Real Madrid find a way to make this interesting? Or even better, do Barcelona find a way or allow Real Madrid to make this interesting? Or is it going to be a continuation of what we've seen, which is that Barcelona kind of just slowly creep farther and farther away from everybody else? That's really the only question I have at this point in terms of the title race. Then you got the battle for the top four. And right now you've pretty much got Atletico Madrid, Real Sociedad, and Real Betis fighting for these final two Champions League spots. It's been Real Sociedad as Team 3 most of the season. However, this is one of the storylines I'm fascinated by that might have flown under the radar because they haven't been a factor in much of anything else other than La Liga. Atletico Madrid are one of the most informed teams in the world right now. They are tearing through La Liga. And so all of a sudden it went from, can they make sure they get fourth to they might catch Real Madrid if Real Madrid aren't careful. And so I feel very confident they're going to make Champions League next season. But obviously we haven't been talking about them because they had a terrible Champions League. They were just bad at the start of the season, but they have really turned things around. Where do they go from here? Can they continue this into next season and actually be a factor in a La Liga title race? Get back to being a factor in the Champions League. This is one of the most interesting things happening in Spain to me. Because it looked like this was going to be this continuation of they're just sort of there. Maybe they do something in the Champions League. But this isn't the team that won the La Liga title. This isn't the team that made Champions League finals. Can they get back to that? What does next season look like? Because you've undergone so many changes with, João Felix out, Antoine Griezmann in. There's been kind of this evolution, and then just the Simeone part of this is also fascinating because there was a point where it very much felt like this was just kind of the end, and then all of a sudden they started winning every single game they played, and now the story is very different. And then, of course, you got your relegation battle. Elche are effectively going down, barring some kind of miracle. And then you've got 7 teams within 3 points of the relegation zone. 2 of those teams are Sevilla and Valencia. Sevilla in particular. We talk about this in England with, Everton having one of those seasons, West Ham, Leicester, this idea of these big clubs going down. It's not the only place it's happening. Both these teams have had really poor seasons, Sevilla in particular. Can they find a way to survive? Because La Liga is just... The depth of La Liga is reliant on teams like Sevilla, winning Europa Leagues and getting to the knockout stage of the Champions League and those kind of things. And Real Sociedad have kind of taken that place of the 4th team. But if you're La Liga, what you really want is you want all of this coming together. You want Barcelona being Barcelona. You want Real Madrid being Real Madrid. You want Atleti being a third team that can factor into the title race every once in a while. And then you need 2 or 3 more teams, ideally even more than that can cause some damage. And, Real Betis have done that to a certain extent. Sociedad have done that. But Sevilla has generally been that team. And then Valencia also with the Yunus Musa factor. I wanted to throw them in there. And obviously, again, one of the bigger clubs in Spain. There is no guarantee either of those teams are staying up. So that's something to keep an eye on in La Liga is who ends up getting relegated and is there a big club that is headed to the 2nd division. Then we get Serie A, where obviously there's not much to discuss about the title race. And then some other really interesting things to get to here. So my title race storyline is, I just threw on the screen, Napoli. My question is, what is the legacy of this season for Napoli? They're going to win. How much do they win by? Do they set records? What do they go on and win a Champions League 2? Do they start resting guys to try and win the Champions League because they're so far ahead and they just kind of crawl to the finish line? And so the end product in terms of the table and the record is not that impressive. Obviously, the biggest story here is going to be the fact that Napoli won this league and won this league so convincingly and how great this team is. But do we kind of have the numbers and the stats to back it up? Do we have 2 trophies to show for it? Are they truly the best team in Europe, as I believe they've been almost the entire season? Can they prove that by winning a Champions League 2? Just what does this final product look like? I am fascinated to find out. To me, that's the question here. And it doesn't, even if they kind of stumble a little bit down the stretch because they're more focused on Champions League, it doesn't take anything away. It doesn't mean that they're less convincing or they weren't as great. I'm just curious if the numbers are going to back it up. Because they're to a point where they don't have anything else to they're so far ahead that you can just shut it down. The fact that they're in that position this early is the legacy to me. But do they kind of have their name etched in the record books and in the history more than just kind of you had to see this team to appreciate them, remember how great they were, those kind of things? Because that's all a given. The question is what else is going to come of this phenomenal season Napoli are having. Then you get to the European spots and Juventus. And I threw these together because Serie A is the one league. Well, the Premier League kind of has this. But consistently, with the rise of Atalanta, you have 7 teams for 6 spots. And the difference is that most years, that is your top 7. Whereas the Premier League, you get some ups and downs, and Usually there's one of the big six who's not actually finishing in the top 7 and that kind of thing. Since if Atalanta are good, basically you've got your top 7 because all of them are doing some good things right now. You know, Lazio surging up the table, Roma are being Roma. You got the Milan clubs going again, and then of course Juventus. So it's not only the fact that this is just really compelling because every week the 2 through, I guess, 5 basically change because nobody can consistently put together a run of games. Either they lose in the league, they lose in Europe. It's been really kind of annoying trying to make a top 25 because it's just, okay, one Italian team in, one Italian team out because, Lazio's second in the league and they just got knocked out of the Europa or the Conference League. And the numbers actually back up that they're really good from a goal difference standpoint and things like that. And I'm still just not convinced because of what's been happening in Europe. It's bizarre that way. But at the end of the day, those are your 7 teams fighting for 6 spots, and then there's the Juventus part of this. Does this points deduction actually hold up? Are we getting to the end of the season where this thing is in effect, and that if they don't, beat teams by 15 points, they're not playing in Europe? Because they are the second best team in this league, and it is not particularly close. And they have actually gotten back to the point where they are in contention to at least get a Europa League or Conference League spot. It's not out of the question they get Champions League. I still think it's a bridge too far. They just don't have enough time. But they are second in the league if you just go based on points earned and you take away the deduction. And that gap just continues to grow. They are team number 2. Where do they actually end up in the table? How does all of that play out? Of course, it's Juventus. It's, drama. It's illegal dealings. It's points deduction. The story kind of writes itself. Then you get to the relegation battle. Just real quick here. The question is basically, can Hellas Verona, Sampdoria, or Cremonese pull off some kind of miracle? All of them are at least 5 points away from safety. You have a very clear bottom of the table, and unlike most of these other leagues, where it's a jumbled mess. Not the case in Serie A. And then finally, apologies there, Fiorentina. And this is what I was alluding to at the beginning about storylines and things you may not have been paying attention to. Fiorentina had an awful start to the season, and all of a sudden, they have turned this thing around. They are surging up the table. They're up to 9th, which, again, do they have time to make it all the way up to become a factor in that top 7? Probably not, but it's not out of the realm of possibility at this point. They're facing Cremonese, who's probably going to get relegated, in the Coppa Italia semis, and then the Conference League quarterfinals. They survived the bad stretch and now are looking at 2 great opportunities for silverware and a really good finish to the season domestically as well. Again, there's no reason to really have been talking about them in the larger context and kind of the conversation about the European season. But they're one of the more compelling stories in Italy and something worth following as we get to the final weeks of the season. And then we got Ligue 1. Going to start real quick here. Does the top 4 change? Does anybody pass anybody? Are the kind of the 4 teams up there, PSG, Marseille, Lens, Monaco, the 4 that get into the Champions League? Do Rennes or Lille have something to say about this? How does that play out? Because the gap isn't, again, it feels different because it's PSG up top with that lead, right? As opposed to PSG trying to chase somebody. They're going to win the league. That's not particularly interesting. So my bigger question, I'm kind of putting all that together, is do we see anything, or do we kind of coast to the finish with what we've basically had all season? Number two, and I really kind of regret that I haven't gotten to talk much about this. So this is the kind of thing I wanted to get to with this setup and why I designed the show this way this week. How far can Will Still take Rems? This is one of the most remarkable stories of the season, and again, because it's League On, it's a team that isn't part of the bigger conversation outside of Florian Balogun. It certainly is getting attention, but if this was the Premier League or something, it would get a whole new level of attention. Go look at the way this season started and what Will Still, who, by the way, they have to pay a fine because he's not a qualified coach every game. Look at what he has done with this team. They just lost. And I think before they lost, I want to say that the last time they lost was in September. They had this incredible unbeaten run. They played PSG in this stretch. I mean, they played everybody in the league, basically. What this guy is doing is absolutely incredible. So, where do they finish? How does this play out? And then, of course, what is part two as this continues? Because this dude is a rising star for what he's doing. It's an incredible story that I wanted to show some love to. And it's got kind of these weird connections, with the Balogun thing. And they were in a terrible spot. And now they're just coasting, seeing how much fun they can have. And it's an incredible story. Finally, we've got the relegation battle, of course. You've got 5 points between 15th and 19th. And the bottom four teams, 17, 18, 19, 20, get dragged into the relegation in some way, shape, or form. Because you got the playoff in there, all that. So you're talking about, 4 teams. Sorry. 5 teams for 3 spots, basically. 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. And then, yeah. So I'm not going to get too much into that. You can go look at who the teams are. But this is more along the lines of the Premier League where there's, and La Liga as well, where you've got multiple teams in here. There's some teams that don't feel safe. How does this all play out in the relegation zone in League 1? That is all for the kind of European reset, if you will. I'm going to take my final break and then come back real quickly with the weekend look ahead. You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. It is time for the weekend look ahead as always. For the first time, all 7 leagues, your 5 major ones in Europe, Major League Soccer, and WSL, all to highlight here coming out of this international break. And we got a really very nice kind of welcome back. Starting in England, Liverpool at Manchester City on Saturday. Again, Liverpool somehow hanging around in this top 4 race. They simply can't afford to lose many games. At some point, they got to make a run. They can't just win a couple here and then drop another one. They got to put together a run of games. And Manchester City, obviously, you're just wondering how many points they can afford to drop if they're really going to push Arsenal. Speaking of Arsenal, Leeds at Arsenal also on Saturday. Southampton at West Ham on Saturday. 2 teams in the thick of that relegation battle. And then Manchester United at Newcastle on Sunday. At some point, somebody's got to take control of this top 4 race. This is a huge opportunity for Newcastle, who have kind of turned things around after that really bad stretch where they just kept drawing and couldn't beat anybody. Can you pick up a home win against Manchester United, give yourself a confidence boost, and really put the pressure on Spurs? Because again, Newcastle, winning, averaging more points per game is what I should say. they are in the best position to go get that fourth spot and to get Champions League. Can they actually do it? In Spain, Barcelona at Elche on Saturday, Valencia at Real Madrid on Sunday, Real Sociedad at Villarreal on Sunday. That's a big game in terms of those other European spots, as is Real Betis at Atletico Madrid. So you've got some really good matchups with, Champions League and European qualification implications in Spain. Italy, Atalanta at Cremonese on Saturday, Fiorentina at Inter on Saturday, Hellas Verona at Juventus on Saturday, Lazio at Monza on Sunday, Sampdoria at Roma on Sunday, and your biggest game of the weekend, AC Milan at Napoli on Sunday. And then, of course, these teams are going to also play in the Champions League quarterfinals, so they're going to get real friendly with each other here in the next few weeks. Germany, Stuttgart at Union Berlin on Saturday, and then, of course, Der Klassiker Dortmund at Bayern on Saturday. I've been saying for weeks, this is the game that's going to determine it, that you can't consider Dortmund's the favorites until they get through this game. If they get through this game at the top of the table, then they are the favorites. It is theirs to lose. And they can now do so with a draw. But can they actually make it happen? They've played Bayern really well. It just, most of the time, they seem to come up one goal short, one play short. Does that change? Is this the day where they really take control of the league and finally end Bayern's dominance? Mainz at Leipzig also on Saturday. Hertha Berlin at Freiburg on Saturday. Those are kind of your big games in Germany. My policy is just kind of including the games with the teams in the thick of these European races, which is why I have so many in Italy every week. France, Montpellier at Marseille on Friday, Lens at Rennes on Saturday, Strasbourg at Monaco on Sunday, OL Reign at PSG on Sunday, and then Major League Soccer. Had a more difficult time than usual picking the most interesting games for me this weekend, but I settled on 4. Seattle Sounders at LA Galaxy is the one that sticks out to me above the rest. Galaxy need to get this thing going. Seattle look like themselves. Jordan Morris, at some point I'll probably talk more about him. Dude scoring goals for fun. That's terrifying for the rest of the league. I'm going to save that as a tease and not tell you exactly why, because it's probably not quite what you think. But that's a huge game for the Galaxy at home. NYCFC at New England Revolution. The Revs are very quietly playing very well. I'm all in on this. I was tempted to buy in before the season started, but I needed to actually see it. It is working. And in the East, where nobody's been all that impressive so far, Bruce Arias got his guys rolling. Nashville at Orlando. Both off to pretty good starts. Can somebody kind of take that next step, try and get themselves closer to the top of the standings? And Minnesota at Sporting Kansas. Minnesota at St. Louis. Sorry. I'm just going to put St. Louis in here every week until they lose. That was the promise I made. This is absolutely incredible. Minnesota are also off to a good start, despite what they went through this offseason. Can they be the team to finally take points off these guys? I mean, every week I still have this mental hurdle with considering St. Louis a Supporters' Shield contender. They're absolutely a playoff team. There's no doubt about that. But every week they just keep going. What they're doing is incredible, so that is what is up next for them. All those games on Saturday. And then NWSL. I picked 3 to highlight here. Portland at Kansas City Current on Saturday. The Current are nowhere near full strength yet. Got to get everybody back before we can make any commentaries on this new look team. Thorns looked like the Thorns, but this is going to be, Kansas City getting to play at home. What do they look like in week 2? OL Reign at Gotham. Reign playing some really interesting kind of litmus test games. Had one against the Spirit last weekend. Now you get Gotham, who got a win in pretty impressive fashion in week 1 with that new look team. Off to a really good start. Lynn Williams, all of that good stuff. And then My fourth one, Washington at Racing Louisville. I'm all in on the Spirit rebirth and kind of rejuvenation. Can that continue against a Louisville team playing at home, a Louisville team that has some really nice pieces as well? So those are the NWSL games I am looking at. That is the show for tonight. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to hit the